The city was drowning in a grey, relentless drizzle, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel weary. From inside his worn yellow cab, Arthur Walsh watched the evening rush hour congeal into a static tableau of brake lights and angry horns. Neon signs from storefronts bled across the wet asphalt, their vibrant colors dissolving into murky reflections on his windshield, which the struggling wipers could only smear, not clear. The air inside the taxi was stale, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten conversations and the faint, lingering scent of cheap air freshener. It was a metal and glass box of isolation, a solitary bubble moving sluggishly through the veins of a metropolis that never slept but always seemed exhausted. The only sound marking the passage of time was the soft, rhythmic click of the meter, a constant reminder that his life was measured in miles and minutes, not moments. Behind the wheel, Arthur was a portrait of quiet resignation. At 45, his shoulders had a permanent slump, molded by decades spent hunched over the steering wheel, and his gaze was often distant, lost somewhere between the traffic ahead and a past he tried not to visit. His hands, calloused and thick, rested on the wheel with a familiarity that bordered on apathy. He was part of the cab, an extension of the engine and the chassis, a functional component of the city's vast, impersonal machinery. He navigated the gridlocked streets with an instinct born of repetition, his mind a quiet, hollow space where expectations had long since faded. To his passengers, he was invisible, a silent chauffeur whose only purpose was to get them from one point to another. He had long ago accepted this role, finding a strange, empty comfort in his anonymity. The spell of the monotonous evening was broken by the sharp click of a rear door handle. A small, elderly woman slid onto the vinyl seat, bringing with her a gust of damp air and the delicate, unexpected scent of lavender. She was frail, with hair as white as freshly fallen snow and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. She clutched a small, worn purse in her lap with both hands, her posture poised and dignified despite the city's chaotic energy. Unlike most of his fares, she didn't immediately pull out a phone or bark a destination. She simply settled in, her presence filling the silent cab with a calm that felt both foreign and profound. After a moment, she leaned forward slightly and gave him an address in an old neighborhood. Her voice soft but clear, a gentle melody against the harsh percussion of the rain. The journey began in a shared silence, a stark departure from Arthur's usual routine. He drove automatically, his mind still adrift, but he found himself glancing at her in the rearview mirror more than he normally would. She wasn't scrolling through a feed or lost in a phone call. She was simply watching the city pass by, her expression a mixture of melancholy and quiet curiosity. Then her gaze met his in the mirror, and she held it for a beat, a flicker of genuine connection in the anonymous space. "You have such tired eyes, dear," she said, her voice filled with a warmth that startled him. "They remind me of my grandfather when he used to look after me." The words, so simple and personal, landed with the force of a physical blow, cracking the thick armor of indifference he had spent years building around his heart. For the first time in a long time, someone truly saw him. The image of Eleanor standing alone on that rain-slicked sidewalk burned itself into Arthur's mind. Framed by the rearview mirror, she looked impossibly small, a forgotten porcelain doll left out in a storm. The drizzle softened the edges of her white hair, and the garish city lights swirled around her, threatening to swallow her whole. In that one heartbreaking tableau, Arthur was no longer in his cab in the present. He was 20 years old again, standing on a different curb under a different cold sky, the sound of a heavy oak door clicking shut behind him for the last time. The world had felt vast and predatory then, a concrete wilderness with no shelter in sight, and he had never felt so utterly and completely abandoned. The echo of that long-buried pain was a physical jolt, a ghost's hand on his shoulder. The memory was so vivid it stole his breath. He could still hear his stepmother's voice, a low, poisonous whisper in his father's ear, twisting his youthful mistakes into unforgivable sins. He remembered the shame on his father's face, a weak man's cowardice masquerading as discipline, the way he couldn't even meet his son's eyes as he pointed toward the door. The feeling of the cold night air hitting his face was the same feeling of shock and disbelief that washed over him now. For 25 years, he had built a fortress around that memory, brick by silent brick, convinced that indifference was the only way to survive. But seeing Eleanor, so dignified in her desolation, he realized the fortress had been a prison, and the ghost of that abandoned boy was still trapped inside, waiting. With a sudden, violent screech of tires, Arthur slammed on the brakes, the cab shuddering to a halt in the middle of the street. A chorus of angry horns erupted behind him, but he didn't hear them. All he could hear was a desperate, internal scream. Not her. Not like this. He couldn't drive away and leave her to the mercy of the city, just as he had been left. It was an impulse that defied all logic. A raw, primal need to rewrite the single most painful moment of his own history. He threw the car in park, fumbled with the door handle, and stepped out into the rain. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse with an emotion he couldn't name. "You can't stay here, ma'am," he said, his words cutting through the noise. "Get in. We'll find you somewhere safe." Back inside the cab, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. He had turned off the meter. This was no longer a transaction measured in miles and dollars. It was something else, something terrifyingly human. Eleanor looked at him, her clear blue eyes holding not suspicion, but a quiet, profound gratitude. The silence that settled between them was no longer empty. It was a shared space, a fragile bubble of trust floating through the indifferent city. He drove without a destination, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Is there anyone I can call for you?" he asked gently. "A friend? Family?" She simply shook her head, her gaze fixed on the blurred cityscape. "There's no one left, dear," she answered softly. "It's just me now." The simple finality of her words landed like a stone in his gut. His first idea was a city shelter. He found one a dozen blocks away, its entrance grim and institutional under the flickering fluorescent lights. The moment they stepped inside, the air hit them, a thick, oppressive mixture of disinfectant and despair. The common room was a chaotic scene of loud voices, hollow eyes, and shuffling feet. Eleanor instinctively shrank closer to him, her small hand gripping the sleeve of his jacket. A weary, overworked administrator behind a plexiglass barrier barely looked up from his computer, handing Arthur a stack of forms that seemed miles long. Arthur took one look at Eleanor's frightened face and knew this was impossible. This wasn't a shelter, it was a warehouse for the forgotten, and she deserved better than to be another lost item on a shelf. He led her back out into the rain, a cold, protective anger simmering inside him. The system was broken, a maze of bureaucracy that offered processes instead of compassion. He felt a surge of defiant responsibility, a feeling so foreign it almost made him dizzy. It's moments like this, when one person decides to stand in the gap the world has left, that define our humanity. These quiet acts of courage are the stories that need to be told, and your support in subscribing helps us continue to share them with a world that needs to hear them. Back in the sanctuary of the cab, he made a decision. There was only one other place he could think of to go, a place he hadn't willingly shared with anyone in over a decade. He turned the key in the ignition and headed for his own small, empty apartment. The apartment was exactly as he'd left it. Meticulously clean, sparsely furnished, and utterly devoid of personality. It was a space designed for sleeping and leaving, not for living. As Eleanor stepped inside, her quiet presence seemed to instantly highlight the profound loneliness of the place. She sat on the edge of his worn grey sofa, her purse still clutched in her lap. looking like a queen visiting a peasant's hovel. A wave of panic washed over Arthur. What was he doing? He was a man whose own mind was beginning to betray him, a man who sometimes forgot where he'd parked his own cab. How could he possibly be responsible for another human being? The fear of failing her, of his memory lapses causing her harm, was a paralyzing, ice-cold dread. Just as the panic threatened to consume him, Eleanor's soft voice broke the silence. "Is that your mother?" she asked, pointing to a small, dusty, silver-framed photograph on a bookshelf. It was the only personal item in the entire room. In the picture, a much younger Arthur stood beside a woman with a warm, radiant smile. "Yes," he managed to say, his throat tight. "She passed away a long time ago." Eleanor smiled wistfully. "She had kind eyes," she said, "just like yours, when you're not so tired." Her simple, gentle words were an anchor in his storm of anxiety. For the first time, the apartment felt less like an empty box and more like a potential refuge. He wasn't just bringing a stranger into his space. He was letting a little bit of light into his own darkness. The next morning, the reality of his decision came with the harsh light of day. At the taxi depot, grabbing a coffee before his shift, he endured the casual cruelty of his fellow drivers. "Heard you picked up a stray." "Artie," one of them jeered, a smirk on his face. "Playing social worker now?" Another one chimed in, "Better be careful. Old folks can be a lot of trouble. She'll have you wrapped around her little finger before you know it." Each comment was a small, sharp jab, reinforcing the idea that what he was doing was foolish. A deviation from the unwritten rule of their profession: don't get involved. For a moment, their cynical laughter made him doubt himself, made him feel the familiar sting of being an outsider. He turned his back on them, the coffee cup warm in his hands, and walked away without a word. Their voices faded behind him, becoming just another part of the city's meaningless noise. He was choosing to tune it out, to listen instead to the quiet, insistent pull in his own chest. This is that critical moment in any person's story, the point where the path diverges and you have to decide which one to take. If you feel the power in that choice, in turning away from the crowd to follow your own compass, please subscribe. Your support allows us to keep exploring these transformative journeys. He knew they didn't understand, because for 25 years he wouldn't have understood either. But now, for the first time, he had a reason to go home. Doing the right thing officially proved to be its own kind of nightmare. He found the number for Adult Protective Services and made the call, his heart pounding with a strange mix of hope and apprehension. The voice on the other end of the line was clipped and impersonal, immediately casting a pall of suspicion over his story. "So, you just picked up a woman you don't know and took her to your apartment?" the social worker asked, her tone dripping with disbelief. "What are your intentions, Mr. Walsh?" He tried to explain, to convey the simple, human impulse behind his actions, but his words felt clumsy and inadequate against her professional skepticism. He felt like a suspect being interrogated, his compassion twisted into something questionable and potentially sinister. Despite the external pressures and his own deep-seated fears, a fragile routine began to blossom in the sterile apartment. He learned that Eleanor liked her tea with a splash of milk and 1 sugar. He'd leave for his shift, and she would be there, sitting by the window when he returned. In the evenings, she would tell him stories about growing up in a city he barely recognized, a place of streetcars and corner grocers. The silence in his home was replaced by the soft murmur of her voice and the scent of the simple meals he learned to cook for them. He found himself remembering the little things. Her favorite color was periwinkle blue. She hummed when she was content. And in the act of remembering for her, he felt the frayed edges of his own mind begin to knit themselves back together. The sharp, official rap on the apartment door sounded like a judge's gavel. Arthur felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach as he opened it to find a woman in a practical blazer, holding a clipboard like a shield. She introduced herself as Miss Albright, from Adult Protective Services. Her smile professional and entirely devoid of warmth. Her eyes scanned the small, clean apartment, taking in the sparse furniture and the tiny figure of Eleanor sitting quietly on the sofa. Eleanor didn't seem afraid. She simply watched the woman with a placid curiosity, as if observing a new species of bird through the window. But Arthur knew what this visit meant. It was the system arriving to impose its cold, impersonal logic on the fragile human sanctuary they had begun to build. The air grew thick with unspoken verdicts, the threat of separation hanging between them like a shroud. Miss D. Albright sat on the edge of a chair, her posture rigid, and began to speak in a calm, measured tone that felt more menacing than any shout. She explained that, following their assessment, they had secured a place for Eleanor at a state-run long-term care facility. She used phrases like structured environment, comprehensive medical oversight, and the most responsible course of action. Each word was a sterile, bureaucratic brick, building a wall between him and Eleanor. To the system, Eleanor was a case file, a problem to be solved and filed away. Arthur listened, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. The echo of his stepmother's voice, whispering in his memory about what was best for everyone, as she convinced his father to throw him out. He was being told, once again, that his care wasn't good enough. He looked over at Eleanor. She wasn't looking at the social worker, she was looking at him. In her clear blue eyes, there was no fear, no pleading, only a deep and unwavering trust that he found both terrifying and profoundly strengthening. In that single, silent gaze, he saw the entirety of his own lonely history reflected back at him. He saw the 20-year-old boy left on the curb, the 45-year-old man driving an empty cab through an indifferent city. For 25 years, he had accepted being disposable. He had believed the world's verdict that he was just a component, a driver meant to transport others to their destinations while never having one of his own. But Eleanor's quiet faith told him something different. It told him he was home, and so was she. The fear that had been gnawing at him finally gave way to a calm, unshakable resolve. Arthur rose to his feet, not with aggression, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who had finally found solid ground. He stood between Miss Albright and Eleanor, a quiet protector. "I've spent 25 years just being a driver," he said, his voice low but carrying across the small room with absolute clarity. "Taking people from point A to point B, never really knowing where I was going myself. For the first time in my life, I've found a destination." He turned his head slightly to look at the small woman on his couch, his expression softening. "Her place is here, with me. She's not a case file, and she's not a problem to be managed." He looked back at the stunned social worker, the final words landing with the simple, undeniable force of truth. "She's my family now." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant hum of city traffic. Ms. Albright was speechless, her professional script rendered useless. She had clearly prepared for arguments, for tears, for resignation, but not for this. Not for this quiet, dignified declaration of belonging. She saw not a suspect or an irresponsible stranger, but a man who had drawn a line in the sand with his whole heart. Her gaze flickered from Arthur's determined face to Eleanor's serene one, and a flicker of understanding, perhaps even humanity, crossed her features. She slowly closed her clipboard, the click echoing in the silence. "I will have to update the report," she said, her voice lacking its earlier conviction. When she left, the closing of the door wasn't a gavel's final judgment, but the quiet sealing of a new beginning. The legal paperwork was a mountain, a dense forest of clauses and affidavits, but Arthur navigated it with a purpose he hadn't felt in his life. He found a legal aid lawyer, a young, earnest woman who saw not a strange case, but a simple story of two people finding a lifeline in each other. He officially filed for guardianship. The apartment, once a monument to his isolation, began to transform. He bought a soft, periwinkle blue armchair and placed it by the window, where Eleanor could watch the world go by. Small vases of fresh flowers started appearing on the kitchen table. He worked fewer hours, carefully planning his shifts so he could be home to make her dinner. His yellow cab was no longer a rolling prison, but simply the vessel that took him away from and then faithfully returned him to his true destination. With his new sense of responsibility came a clarity he hadn't known was possible. He finally saw a doctor about his memory, not for his own sake, but for hers. The diagnosis was a quiet revelation. He wasn't suffering from a degenerative disease, but from the profound cognitive effects of chronic stress and deep, unresolved depression. The doctor explained that his isolation had been starving his mind. Purpose, the doctor had said, is a powerful form of medicine. Caring for Eleanor, remembering her stories, anticipating her needs, and sharing the quiet rhythm of their days was literally healing him. The act of tending to her life was breathing life back into his own. The hollow, haunted look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by the steady, gentle light of a man who knew his place in the world. Arthur came to understand that his life hadn't been empty because he drove a cab. It had been empty because he had no one to drive home to. He had spent decades believing that family was a door that had been closed to him forever, a wound that could never be healed. Eleanor taught him that family wasn't about blood or a shared past, but about a shared present, built one cup of tea, one shared story, one quiet evening at a time. It was a choice you made every day to show up for someone. These are the stories that give us all hope, reminding us that we have the power to build the families our hearts need. And your subscription is what gives us the power to continue sharing them. It helps us prove that a simple act of kindness can change everything. 3 years later, Arthur's cab was the same, but a small, smiling photograph was propped on the dashboard, him and Eleanor on a park bench, her head resting lightly on his shoulder. He picked up a young man from the train station whose face was a mask of anxiety and defeat. "First time in the city," the passenger mumbled. "It feels like it could swallow you whole." Arthur met his eyes in the rearview mirror, his own gaze now clear and kind. "It can," he agreed softly. "But you're not looking for a place. You're looking for a person." He dropped the young man off, then turned his cab toward his own neighborhood. As he pulled up to his building, he looked up at the window. There she was, a silhouette of white hair and quiet dignity, her hand raised in a small, certain wave. Arthur Walsh was home,